I'll go off to you.
Hi everyone. So just to let you know that this event is also being recorded. So if you don't want to be in it, don't put your camera on, please, or if you don't want your voice in it, type in the chat. But what I was gonna say is, like, again, completely agree with everything Justina said. Also, like, hate crime really reduces it to like individual actions that people have done, which is obviously very liberal and not in the European sense, and not like conducive to any sort of movement towards liberation or any sort of freedom for queer people of color, etc. Yeah, by reducing it to individual, by using like the term hate crime and reducing it to individual actions, like we fail to look at the systems through it which have like cemented transphobia and queerphobia and racism, etc., through like histories of colonialism and imperialism. But also the issue with hate crimes is that the numbers of like hate crimes committed, blah blah blah, comes from people reporting it to the police. So as well as like what happens to the perpetrators of these hate crimes, it's okay, but who's actually going to go to the police to report these hate crimes? And so like the framework of looking at these individual instances of discriminatory language and whatever, and looking at it as hate crime, I think is really ineffective in working towards liberation in any sense.
Yeah, definitely. I'm just going to read out one of the comments. It says, and I completely agree with this, it says, having a very rigid definition of a hate crime means lots of aggressions and assaults are brushed off as okay because they don't fall under these abstract definitions, and it leads to subjective rulings in a homophobic and queerphobic judicial system. Yeah, I completely agree with that. And yeah, so on this subject, I mean, I have lots of thoughts about it. I guess I understand why LGBT organizations, why they go for this and like use the lexicon of crime, because it's like kind of a way of getting harm recognized, but it's actually just completely, it's basically just contributing towards like the expansion of state power. And kind of what does it show about our society that the way to get harm to be seen as legitimate is to make it known or legislated as a crime? And I think that just speaks to how like carceral our society is. And then in terms of like what hate crime legislation actually does, like quite a lot of the different like law commissions and kind of committees on the justice system in the UK, they basically admit that there's not even evidence that it actually works, because basically hate crime legislation makes sentences slightly longer. But I always think to this, like what difference does it make if someone who shouted something transphobic at me gets an extra 2 years on their sentence? Like, what does that do for me? It does absolutely nothing. It doesn't make me feel more safe, doesn't make anyone more safe. And it just like reproduces that cycle of violence. And I find it really objectionable that so many different like mainstream LGBT organizations basically make this political priority, like places like Stonewall and all these different like charities. And we can go into like the problems of like the non-profit industrial complex and stuff like that later on. But I find it really frustrating that this is like this kind of carceral language is, and these like carceral politics is just the priority of a lot of these organizations. And I find it really frustrating. And to add to that, hate crime legislation, people frame it as a way of meeting victims' needs, but it is never accompanied by anything to like increase like support or resources for survivors of hate crime or harm related to queer-phobic or transphobic violence. So I just think it's very disingenuous and a bad way of looking at safety and comfort. And yeah, because I think a lot of the time people, sorry I'm rambling at this point, but people kind of say, oh, hate crime legislation will make us more safe and stuff like that. But it's like, I always think like, who is made more safe by that? Who is made more comfortable by having that sort of thing in place, when it will basically just be used to like imprison more Black and brown people and just increase like the cycle of violence by contributing to the prison industrial complex. So it's just like, it's really bad. And I don't know if anyone else has any thoughts on it.
Yeah, I was just going to add, in regards to the last question, I think we see in just like the nature of desirability, you know, like we see that the criminal justice system will also play into that. So those who are seen as more desirable, so those who are proximate to whiteness, those who are able-bodied, like those who are skinny, for example, like we know that the different structures impact the way people and thus the state view other people. So like who is going to be protected, who is actually the focus of this? Like it's not the fat disabled trans woman who's the focus of it. It's not. So I think we need to be very careful when we think about hate crime and framing it as people have said, as crimes that can be punished and that can be fully addressed and holistically addressed by the state. But yeah, if anyone has anything that they want to say, feel free to put your hand up, put it in the chat. Right, okay, we can move on to the next slide then. I can take this one. So this chapter is regulatory sites, management, confinement, and HIV/AIDS by Michelle Potts. And I'll give you guys a couple minutes to read through it. But we want to kind of discuss and think about how the treatment of those living with HIV in prisons demonstrates the urgency of abolition, and how do we critically combat the criminalization of HIV and other STIs/STDs, both in regards to interpersonal relationships and on a greater institutional level. So whilst you guys read it, I can start talking. Yeah. I think HIV especially has been criminalized in the way that it has been, and it's been addressed in the way that it has been, because it affects communities that are most marginalized. So for example, LGBTQ plus communities and Black communities in Africa with the AIDS crisis. And because it's been those who are on the periphery of society and those who society essentially doesn't prioritize and doesn't necessarily care about, then it has meant that consequent treatment and addressing it as a matter of concern doesn't occur. We know that it doesn't occur, and a lot of times it ends in death. And in prisons, because of the nature of prisons, because they exist outside of society while also existing within society, means that the systems of oppression are intensified, because there's people who can perpetuate that and people who can be violent towards people within the same prison, and no one is reprimanding that. That prison is the reprimand, so there's no reprimand to the reprimand, if that makes sense. So yeah, I think we acknowledge that it does need to be treated with a matter of urgency, and we acknowledge that abolition, again, as we know, it's not a fun thing, it's not cute, it needs to happen very quickly. It's a matter of urgency, it's necessary to happen because people's lives and well-being are at stake. But if anyone else has anything that they'd like to add, you know the drill.
I can add a bit for the moment if no one has anything else to say for the moment. When I was reading this chapter, also another big trigger warning for death, transphobia, state neglect and stuff like that. But it gave a story of this trans woman who basically died in a prison in California. In an immigration detention facility, and basically she was denied the medication that she needed because she was experiencing an age-related health complications, and she wasn't she was HIV positive, but before she before she entered the detention facility, but then she was in really good health, she was fine. And then when she got into prison, she basically was denied dapazone, which exposed her then to a lot of infections. And then although lots of the other incarcerated people who were around her kept on saying to the guards, you need to give her this, they basically just completely ignored her, and she was in a segregated part of the detention facility because on the grounds of her having HIV. And yeah, and then she died. Obviously, it's really just another example of just like state neglect and the disposability, especially of like Black trans women, and it was just awful. But I was reading about it a bit more, and basically the only reason that we know that this had actually happened is because basically her family sued the prison for it. But I was just thinking about this in the context of heteronormativity, that like how many different stories have we not heard of about like violence in prisons, because like queer people are just pushed out of their family and they have no one to advocate for them when they are in the system. Because if you don't have that support network of the family, which is we can act as like, which can act, not always, but can act as like a cushion against violence in a like a very like violent world, right? Then you basically have no one, like you have no one writing to you, you're just completely alone. um and so it just made me think about like, this is one case that we found out about just because they were still in touch with their family, but there must be so many people that we don't even hear about. And I think this just links to the thing that lots of people think that like they just assume that people in prison aren't queer, and it's like very racist and stuff like that. But um yeah, it just made me think about all those stories that we don't hear about, and that made me really sad and angry. But yeah, Josephina.
Um, I think another big reason why the AIDS crisis, again with the language that's used around it, is it can be very like sensationalist and like how we speak about HIV/AIDS. But I think a lot of it is just like related to criminalization and how so many like things or like livelihoods or like just people are criminalized inherently for just like their being, because we know like the people who live with AIDS, like HIV/AIDS, or who are affected by HIV/AIDS disproportionately are like trans people, sex workers, men who have sex with men, like injected drug users, and all of these people are like, all of the things they practice or like do and the ways that they live their lives have historically been criminalized. So there are like other, like obviously treatment towards HIV/AIDS has developed and has improved in the past like few decades. But at the start of the crisis, like there was no rush for the medical industry to want to like provide care for these people, because they were just viewed as being like on the edges or on the periphery of society. Like these are decisions that they've made for themselves, basically labeling like queerness or just like transness as being like a choice. Like ultimately, we haven't forced you to be queer, we haven't forced you to be trans, therefore like these are things that you have to deal with on your own. Like you're not meant to be provided care by the state or by like medical services. And that's just because these people are constantly just, we see that they like, or we have been told that they just constantly have to suffer. Like these are their decisions, therefore the state shouldn't have to provide, or the state shouldn't have to invest in like funding for like medical care for those living with HIV/AIDS. And the same thing with like sex workers, even though like sex work has become so like commodified, and we see like, I don't know if this is a word, but like the celebritization of sex work, like with like OnlyFans and things like that, and like how sex work is seen as so much more trendy, it's more accessible now. And people who used to do sex work as like a way to stay alive and a way to provide for their communities, obviously that still does happen, but partaking in sex work is a lot easier now, especially with like technology. And even though we acknowledge the fact that like sex work has become more like of a commodity or like it's a growing business, we don't think of how so many people are still in danger, or like people are still endangered by sex work, and they don't do it just as like a thing on the side or like a lifestyle or like a fun lifestyle, but it's because they need that to survive. And those people are obviously suffering, or those people are living with HIV/AIDS, but again there isn't like grace like afforded to them, because again we're thinking like, these are your own decisions, you're deciding to put your life at risk. And then HIV/AIDS as something that people live with is a concern for everyone. Like in all the activism that we do, like it's a concern, like it's a product of like racism, sexism, colonialism, homophobia, everything, classism. Like it's literally like it not being something which is treated like with enough care in all like parts of society is because of all of these systems of oppression. So I think like it's just the way that we just view everything as being criminal. Like everything is just criminalized, and that's just bad vibes. But again, I think again with a lot of stuff we're going to talk about today, like we don't have answers, but I guess it's good that we're having discussions about these things, because these are all things which are like seen as taboo. Like we're not supposed to talk about HIV/AIDS, even though millions of people are living with it, and like it doesn't have to be something which is constantly sensationalized with it being called like an epidemic or a crisis, but it also isn't something that we just shouldn't talk about. So there's kind of like the line that you have to walk.
Yeah, and I was just gonna add on, I feel like even like the whole stigma around HIV and AIDS is still just ongoing, and there's still so much alienation of queer people in society, because I think it's even recent that only now can queer people give blood. Like, please correct me if I'm wrong, but like before they couldn't, because of like the scare of HIV and AIDS, when like clearly it just doesn't make sense. It's just a way to again further criminalize queer people and alienate them from society. But yeah, just wanted to talk about how it's ongoing.
Yeah, and just to add on to that, I was listening to a podcast the other day, the Receipts podcast, and they were talking about when they were like first introduced to HIV, like where they first saw it, and one of them said that it was on Girlfriend, so like the American show Girlfriend, and it makes me think about, I don't want to say the responsibility, but the impact and the use of media in ensuring that not only is there education, but it also encourages people to think about the ways that they facilitate like the criminalization and the othering of those with HIV. So that's that. And also I think about the Rwandan genocide and how many Rwandan women who were raped by Tutsi or Hutu, I don't know, the one in the wrong, that like those men, and like they were diagnosed and they had HIV, and how that's completely divorced from the wider legacy of colonialism, of the wider legacy of nations being created, and these two communities are being forced together, and they never had they existed in the same proximity before, but because of colonialism and because of capitalism and because of all these factors that, you know, like that greatly it completely shook the structures of those African communities, or those communities in Africa. Then it I think the whole conversation, it can't be divorced. Like colonialism completely is linked to healthcare is completely linked to trans rights are wholly linked to like abolition. Like all of these factors, all of these things are interconnected, so when we do address them, we need to address them like they are. Asosa has her hand up.
Yeah, the point I was going to make kind of flew out my head, but I was thinking about how oh God, what am I saying? Yeah, so like the like logic or illogic of hate crime, or oh my God, like putting people in prison for hate crime, whilst also like the same state or the same like prison system like criminalizing and penalizing queerness and like people who are HIV positive in prison. Like I read the last bit of writing on the slide, and it's saying about how in South Carolina all access to work release programs for HIV positive people is like just strictly prohibited, and so like the logic/illogic of someone in prison for hate crime being able to access like all of this stuff, whilst also like denying access to that to people who are HIV positive. And then I guess kind of talks to like, what are we actually doing when we're putting people in prison? Like what is the actual purpose of it? And then also as well, I was thinking about how HIV or AIDS is kind of treated by society as kind of like out of sight, out of mind. Like we won't engage, we won't talk about it. If we can just criminalize these people and lock them up and treat them like absolute trash, like it's just kind of like out of sight, out of mind type thing. And about how that's obviously like violently reproduced like in the prison system as well. Yeah, I'll stop here.
Yeah, and just to add on to that, it shows the extent to which healthcare is criminalized, and a lot of health issues are criminalized. So yes, HIV is criminalized, but then we also think about like drug use and how prisons, they just don't exist for the well-being of people. We've been knowing that, but even like how it frames to have, say for example, like how they have like a medical doctor, of course, like not of course, but like a doctor in prisons, and how kind of the prison system and the prison system kind of like reforms itself or presents itself as something that it isn't, and how we need to be like a lot more vigilant when it does come to like healthcare and all of those things. And then I was also going to say about like solitary confinement and how sometimes we can replicate that in our interpersonal relationships. So as much as we may not lock someone in a room for them to be by themselves, we also need to recognize that exclusion is like a metaphorical form of solitary confinement, and we need to be very conscious when we do interact with people with HIV or just any criminalized like infection or disease or whatever, that we don't perpetuate these same like systems of violence, because as we were speaking about in Let's Talk About Sex, our personal life needs to align with our political, and there can't be any like discrepancies or any difference between the two. Like we need to actually do what we say that we believe to believe, and yeah, that's what I'm saying.
Does anyone else have anything to add? If not, we can go on to the next slide. Yeah, go on to the next slide. So yeah, this chapter is called How to Make Prisons Disappear, Queer Immigrants, the Shackles of Love and the Invisibility of the Prison Industrial Complex. So I don't know if anyone else has read this one, but I found this really, really interesting. And I'll just give it a little background to the story, because it kind of challenged a lot of like, I don't know, it challenged my assumption of what might have happened in the situation. So basically, the chapter contrasts the stories of two undocumented immigrants in the US and their treatment by ICE, so like the immigration awful people, and then how their cases were received in the mainstream media by like LGBT organizations. So basically, this is person Shirley Tan, and she was a lesbian undocumented immigrant who ICE tried to deport. And then I think they managed to stop it, but there was like a big media campaign, and she received a lot of media support, and then the decision was overturned. And then the author contrasts this with the story of Rigo Padillo, or Padillo, in Chicago, who was an undocumented immigrant who we don't know the sexuality, who committed a crime for driving under the influence, but he barely received any public support. But eventually had his deportation deferred. And basically this chapter was kind of looking at, so you might assume if you basically only look through the lens of heteronormativity, basically if you looked at heteronormativity through like a kind of solely white perspective, you might assume that like that Shirley would be the one who didn't receive any media support or attention. But basically like it kind of talks about how the discourse of like good LGBT and trans people, read white, were seen as kind of like deserving immigrants who didn't deserve to be in prison, whereas like there was like a kind of criminalization and racialization of this other immigrant who didn't receive much support at all, because he was basically just assumed not to be queer, basically just on his race. And basically it kind of it kind of talks about how, I don't know if I explained this very well, basically. So then Shirley, the lesbian undocumented immigrant, was like, then like all these senators like came out and like supported her, and then they basically kind of like co-opted her struggle into this thing about creating legislation to secure the rights of lesbian and gay people to sponsor their partners for immigration. And whereas like Padillo's case was basically completely ignored until the last minute, and this basically this chapter kind of like leads on to this to kind of talk about how LGBT organizations have like gone in this reformist approach to the prison industrial complex and immigration system in the US, to focus on how to make the immigration system more inclusive, to try and help because basically before this, like if you had a queer partner, you wouldn't be able to sponsor them for immigration, and basically all these senators like co-opted them into this thing about like how to make immigration more inclusive and stuff like that, but then kind of completely ignored the main point, which is like we need to abolish ICE. So basically, it's a really long-winded explanation of that chapter. But basically, I don't know if anyone had read it or like had any like insights in about how Padilla and Tan were completely differently treated, and like how like white queerness is kind of sometimes deployed in a way to distinguish between deserving and undeserving immigrants. This is quite a complex and sort of controversial issue, but I thought it was interesting, and it challenges the idea that like just because you from like a queer background, you won't necessarily always be treated better than a assumedly straight person. I don't know if anyone had any thoughts. I hope I've explained this okay. Yeah.
Yeah, on this, but kind of on this, but kind of not on this. In regards to, sorry. Yeah, in regards to the like immigration and love, just kind of going back to what I was saying before, but we know like with with the nature of colonialism and underdevelopment and exploitation and exploitation, it's meant that migration is often like necessary for many like Black communities in like colonized areas, for many Black communities in colonized areas. So while they are immigrating because of like underdevelopment and exploitation, they're also faced with, again, like transphobia, homophobia to the communities that they're migrating to. But had colonialism not come, then there wouldn't be like the need to migrate. So yeah, that's just in all, just colonialism. Why did you do that? Like, why did you need to do that? You know? But yeah, I haven't read this chapter. But then even in terms of like deserving immigrants, I was gonna say this, but I feel like it will link to another point, but I'll just, I'll link it when I get to it. But how there's like deservingness of in fact, no, I'll just talk about it later. But yeah, if anyone else has anything that they want to say.
I was just going to add one more thing before we can move on. I don't know if I explained this very well. But basically, like, another contextual point for this is that like some of these like LGBT organizations were like, the way that they use this kind of discourse of like, yeah, as I said earlier, the undeserving deserving immigrant. They were like, oh no, this queer immigrant, like they didn't deserve to be like in prison. No, they were like, they're queer and they weren't a criminal. Whereas like Rigo had committed some form of like he had some charge against him for like driving under the influence or something like that, and they were like trying to present like this idea of like queerness as this like pure and like uncriminal thing, as a way to like differentiate between who was deserving to be like incarcerated or not. And I just thought it was really harmful and horrible, and just indicative of a lot of like the politics of a lot of mainstream LGBT organizations, in that they basically were just like not committed to like completely, basically they're not committed to like prison abolition. They're just like committed to like making things better for like a very small minority of their community, basically just like more privileged queer people, and it just frustrates, again, as there's probably a running thread through this thing, just like mainstream LGBT organizations, like they basically don't care about like a significant amount of their community. They're literally just there to like to kind of like perpetuate like the interests of like the privileged members of those groups. And like it would be great if like a lot of those mainstream organizations would like actually grapple with abolitionist politics, and like recognizing that like we actually need to abolish prisons, not just make them slightly nicer for trans and queer people, like make them a bit more comfortable, or like that sort of thing. So it just really frustrates me. But anyway, yeah, so if anyone else has any thoughts on that, we can just put it in the chat. And yeah, so it's from Captive Genders. Yeah, we'll move on to the next one. Let's see what it is. Sorry, yeah, can we move to the next slide, please? I can't remember, am I taking this one or are you taking it, Rachel?
You can take it.
Okay, sure. So basically this chapter is on, again, like, don't worry if you haven't read it, it's just a springboard for discussion, and we'll go to a general discussion later. So this is called The Only Freedom I Can See, Imprisoned Queer Writing in the Politics of the Unimaginable, by Stephen Dillon. And so again, like, also just for the stuff on the Spain slide, on the little poem is quite triggering, so like just take time out if you need to, but yeah, take time out sort of thing. But basically this chapter is about like the correspondence between Stephen and two incarcerated writers, and then they kind of talk about how like the barriers between communication between people who live in like the free world, as in like outside of prison, versus people who live in prison. And basically they were just talking about the way in which like they had to just completely like recognize every single thing that they assume about everyday life, as someone who doesn't have to live in like a tiny cell, and how that completely changes what you think is imaginable, both for you and then for the person people who are incarcerated. For instance, like there was this one person who said that the only trip they'd ever been on was on a bus called Bluebird when they were transferred from their hometown to where they are right now. And so they asked the writer to like ask them to like tell them how it felt to like be on a plane and like be outside, because they actually had never been on a trip because they got incarcerated so young and they've been stuck in the prison system for so long. And then there was another poem which was, I won't read it out because it's quite heavy, but it just made me think about freedom and the imagination and how that is affected by incarceration. And I was just wondering if anyone had any thoughts on how that affects, I mean, like, yeah, just like abolition, freedom, and imagination, like how do you think that affects what we can know and think for our futures? Yeah, put it in the chat or put your hand up. I can't hear you yet.
Yeah, I think when it comes to the excerpts at like the bottom right from the poem. Okay, yeah. What you were saying before about that one story of the person whose family, like of their case and their family brought it to light. Oftentimes like bail and just engaging with the carceral system, it requires a lot of money, or it requires money that a lot of trans people do not have, and because of their, say for example, they are excommunicated is a big word, because they are severed from their like family, they're often left in like with their chosen families, for example, and those people in their chosen families oftentimes are from working class or poor backgrounds. So it means that even if you do have family on your side, there's that element of money and capital that restricts you from accessing the same level of like safety and freedom that is afforded by bail. So yeah, just the way capitalism and the carceral system are like set up means that working class trans people are left in a state of vulnerability and they're susceptible to even more harm. I don't know if Asosa wants to say anything.
I think Asosa.
Okay, we don't.
Oh, do you want to say something, or oh yeah, go speak.
I am a victim of bullying. I have been bullied by Kivia to speak. Anyway, what was I gonna say? I don't really know what to say, but I guess like I feel like Josephina talked about this yesterday, but like prisons, like obviously like it's not just like the structural space of the prison, but like also like mentally, and how that then limits and like dictates the way that you are allowed to imagine, or like encouraged to imagine, if that makes sense. And like thinking about like prisons also like limiting or like impacting or shaping the way that you imagine and the way that, and like obviously like castle logic like impacting the way that you imagine like liberation or justice, etc., etc. Yeah, I'm gonna shut up now. I don't really know what else to add other than that.
That's okay, don't worry, that was great. Does anyone have anything else? If not, we can go to the next slide.
And I think this like borders on Afrofuturism, like what we were talking about before, because if they're like, not to like, I don't want to essentialize it or like sensationalize it, like solitary confinement, because it is just one person and their thoughts, and because the conditions are so terrible, it then kind of creates like a necessity out of survival, a necessity, a way to survive out of necessity, whereby whereby engaging with imagination and engaging with borderlessness and engaging with all these things that aren't afforded to them in that solitary confinement is now like it's yeah, like they're forced to engage with it, or they can engage with it despite the conditions that it is under. But then that also says a lot, because Asosa was talking about this when she was talking about her dissertation, about the way that our reality informs our imagination, and if we are restricted by our reality. So Asosa, if you want to jump off that, feel free to. But yeah, I think just the relationship between reality and imagination, it's quite difficult to think about and assess given like conditions that we are in as like oppressed people.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, Sosa.
Yeah, I am still a victim of bullying,
Oh.
but what Rachel was saying as well, like, made me think about the only freedom I can see, and about how like even seeing freedom or like imagining freedom is like, and the way that you imagine freedom is like almost a privilege. Like if you're, like Rachel was talking about, like if you're locked in solitary confinement, the way that you imagine or the way that you are able to imagine is so different from someone who is like, I don't know, like frolicking through the woods like every day. Do you know what I mean? Like your mind is stimulated in different ways, and you're nurtured and encouraged to imagine in different ways. So like the I don't know what the word is, but like I just look at the only freedom I can see, and I think of how like it's a privilege to even just be able to see freedom or to imagine freedom in certain ways, and how like prisons rob people of even that, like not just freedom, but perceptions of freedom and imaginations of freedom as well.
Yeah, definitely. That was really beautifully said. Faye? Yeah.
Yeah, that was a really good point. I was also thinking about like how like the censorship of like materials in the prisons, and how that kind of like is like designed to blinker the imagination, because like the lack of like education and like the that's provided within prisons and stuff, like is so that like the prisoners, like it's just to control them and stuff, and it's just really sad. And it's like, and then it's like a lot of responses would be to like, oh, put money into like prison education, and like but like obviously reform is not the solution here, and it's a shame. But yeah, that's that.
Yeah, definitely.
And on that, kind of where it says like by sea, and where they're talking about how like they're writing to someone outside of the prison. I was talking to someone recently, and they started like having a prison. Is it called a prison pen pal? That sounds a bit. Is that what it's called? Okay, yeah, prison pen pal. And even the process of doing that itself costs money. And I'm just thinking about people in prison who don't have the money, or yes, they can work for the money, but that also means that not that they're contributing, because like that's their. That's their situation. But it means that they need to engage with labor in order to engage with people in the outside world, and in the outside world, or like the outside world, and just in the dynamics, it's just so sinister, I think, because in talking to people in talking to people in expanding like horizons, there is a trade-off, and I don't know, I just feel like prisons are just so bad.
Yeah, and like talking about prisons kind of just reminds me of occupation as well, and specifically like occupation of Palestine and Kashmir. Sorry, I link everything to Palestine and Kashmir, but it kind of is, it is like a prison, like it is like a living death, and it's still that matter of accessibility where we only know the stories that we hear from social media or from white journalists from the West exploiting their stories and trauma. And I was just going to make that parallel between the fact that there's Palestinians and Kashmiris that are still imagining beyond occupational, working along what they've been given in, like working along the occupation in order to imagine a future without occupation is just, yeah, really cool.
Yeah, definitely. And I think like, although this book is focused on like a lot, I guess a lot of it is explicitly engaging with like prisons as physical spaces, which I think is something that we touch on in the next slide. I guess it is important to like look at like, yeah, the prison as a metaphor as well, and in terms of like captive, the title of the book, Captive Gender, is not just about people in like prison facilities. It's about like so many like people under occupation, and like within like colonial gender systems and things like that. So it's always like good to like yeah, broaden our horizons a bit and like think a bit more expansively in that sort of sense. I think that's something we go on to the next slide. So maybe should we go on to the next one? Unless anyone's got anything else to say, then that's completely fine.
I can speak about this one. So from this chapter, Maroon Abolitionist, Black Gender Oppressed Activists in the Anti-Prison Movement in the US and Canada by Julia Sudbury and Julia Opara. So yeah, again, I'll give people a few minutes to just read over it, but things to like consider: if prisons are more than their physical spaces, how must abolitionist organizing / imagining extend past the prison, and what is the relationship between rainbow capitalism, slavery, and prisons? But kind of like we'll talk about that, but just something that what I was referring to in the previous point. In Ghana recently, there's a campaign, or like 12 LGBTQ plus people have been essentially imprisoned by the state, and there's like a campaign called, what's it called? For the 21. So like the for is like free the 21 basically, people who were imprisoned. And I think it's really interesting because kind of like what we were talking about in decolonizing queerness yesterday, but the way that the state the way that the state like it's like the way that the state engages with carcerality, and the consequent implications of that, because it then means that, you know, like safety within the nation, which wasn't even created for or by those people, is like I'm not sure if I'm making sense, but it's like weaponized, and it's made unsafe. And then I'm also reminded of Bobrisky. Like Bobrisky is I love her, but I was first introduced to her probably 2014, and she's like when I was first introduced to her, I think this was when like transness wasn't, well, I don't think she ever said that she was trans. No. Yeah, no, she never said that she was trans, but a lot of people speculated, and a lot of people kind of like prodded and poked at it. And I think from 14 years old, and just learning about like colonialism and the way that gender and the way that gender and the way that binaries were created and like facilitated through colonialism, it then means that people who would have existed before colonialism are then being the subject of so much interrogation. So within this, it's all to say, and I think one particular thing about Bobrisky is that she has capital, she has money. Again, how capitalism is so closely tied with who goes to prison. Obviously, abolish prisons, period. But why that treatment that would be afforded to someone else wasn't afforded to her. Not afforded is the wrong word, but why that one treatment that would have been that one person would have experienced wasn't that she didn't experience. If this all makes sense. So yeah, this is just a little ramble, but back to the questions. If prisons are more than their physical spaces, how must abolitionist organizing / imagining extend past the prison, and what is the relationship between rainbow capitalism, slavery, and prisons? So Josephine.
Yeah, if we're looking at like prisons outside of just like the physical space of the prison, I think everywhere is the prison. Like the family, education, like everywhere is prison. Even like, not even countries, nation states, like everywhere is prison. So ultimately, like we know how like borders were made, like how borders were fashioned. Therefore, like borders are empire, like borders are part of like empire, borders are like prisons. So from like looking at the title of the chapter, Maroon Abolitionist, I like before I read it, like the first thing that I thought was a conversation that we were having about like maroonage in Latin America and the Caribbean. So one example is like in Honduras, in Honduras, there's a group, like an ethnic group called the Garifuna people, and ultimately like they are Maroons because like they're Maroons because they marooned from St. Vincent, the island of St. Vincent, and like left slavery. So like in anti-state, anti-capitalism, whatever like movement, from St. Vincent to Honduras, and they are now like they're like a Black and Indigenous group, and they still have very much like anti-prison, anti-state, like basically anti all the things that we're speaking about movements to this like till today. But like, and it's grounded in the fact that like their history is like them being Maroons, them being abolitionists, but ultimately because of the way like the way that states are formed and the way that states are shaped, they don't have like home because they don't find home in Central America, in Honduras, but they also don't find home in St. Vincent. They also don't find home in Africa because ultimately states, borders, everywhere is like prison. Like prisons aren't homes for people. Prisons aren't meant to be homes for people. They're meant to be like you being completely removed from society. And that's ultimately like a similar feeling of like being without a home or feeling like outside of society or outside of a community is what many people feel with like not having a state or not a state, but like not having like a homeland. So I feel like a lot of people, obviously in varying degrees, because people like physically without a homeland or without like a state, like in the example of Palestine, it's completely different. But there's a feeling of like statelessness or homelessness or being without a home that a lot of people like globally feel. And that's because borders are such an important thing, or like having a nation state is such an important thing in society. So ultimately like prison is everywhere. It's just bad vibes. Anyway.
Yeah. Okay. I'm gonna add to that just by saying that two things. I saw recently, I saw recently there was a TikTok, but I saw it on Twitter, of the old gays and like how they told their stories. Well, the old gays, they're like group of people who go on TikTok, but yeah, they were like telling their stories like, oh, at 21 this was my situation, but now I'm, you know, like I'm here. And then it like by the end of it they were like, and that's why we're partnering with Shake Shack. And it was like, actually capitalism is not really like, it's not adding up. So yeah, I think oftentimes capitalism is just it does things so cosmetically, and yeah, it does things so cosmetically because like at the end of the day it cares about profit. It doesn't care about the livelihood. It doesn't actually care about, you know, gay and trans people, because if it did then it wouldn't exist. But it does exist, so it doesn't. So yeah, I wanted to speak about that. And also in regards to like Palestine and Israel, well, the Israeli occupation of Palestine, and how I mean, I don't know a lot, but I do know that the Israeli government kind of use, like they pinkwash and they do a lot to say, okay, yeah, we'll provide safety for Palestinian LGBTQ plus people, but it's not because they care about the safety of Palestinian LGBTQ plus people. It's because they are they're alone.
And I think, yeah, this is actually following on a point from Josephina as well. but just the fact that binaries generally are just also so restrictive and oppressive, and our prisons, because even like, and I was going to relate this to pinkwashing as well, but just that like idea of like Israel being like the only space for LGBTQ plus people in the Middle East, or the fact that the Middle East is always synonymized with anti-gay people, anti-trans. It's so Orientalist and racist, because I think for me, like a part of like decolonizing, I guess, the Middle East, or like decolonizing borders, the nation state, is reclaiming a history of queer people always existing in Southwest Asia, West Asia, in Asia, and the fact that like the history is there, like queer people have always existed everywhere, but in the context of Iran that I'm speaking about, it was European empire and colonialism that brought their binaries and categorization over and imposed it on people that were borderless and that did not subscribe to binaries of gender and sexuality. And I think this, like when we think of like decolonial imagination, we should also think about like the abolition of binaries, and not subscribing to like pinkwashing or Orientalist stereotypes of the Middle East.
Yeah, and just adding on that as well, kind of going to the first question, just drawing on Afrofuturism as well, and just engaging with our imagination, because I mean, I feel like we do say engage with imagination, but I think it's because imagination is so important. Like so many abolitionists before us, like Toussaint Louverture, the Haitian. I mean, shit. No, but when he was fighting in like the enslaved people, when they were fighting against the system of slavery, they engaged with their imagination, again out of necessity, but also they imagined something and then they went through with it. Like you can't do something without imagining doing it first. So yeah, I think that's just to say imagination is very important, and it's even more necessary with the creation and with the existence of prisons, because prisons are very recent. They were born yesterday. They're very recent. So I think, especially because they are so recent, it's an opportunity to look before their creation, because we have the archives, that we have the knowledge to like look before their implementation and see what yesterday, and see like other alternatives, kind of like Afrofuturism, looking into the past, yes, but also looking into the future and into the present, just completely shaking the foundations of what we know today in order to create what we imagine.
Yeah, 100%. And that also reminded me, I think Kimmy was talking about binaries and colonialism and stuff. And I remember I saw this thing about, basically I was doing some research on like Indigenous movements in Canada and Australia. And it was basically just talking about how like Indigenous communities there have like a really high incarceration rate and like the violence related to that and stuff. And then the person who was writing about it was like talking about how like the issues of like trans and non-binary people in like Indigenous trans and non-binary people in prisons is like really difficult, because like you get not only like it's so hard to be a trans person in prison because you'll probably get put in the wrong one anyway. I mean, no one should be there, but you know, you get put in the wrong gender one anyway. But if you're non-binary, like where do you go? And then I was like, yeah, God, that must be so hard and da. And then the person was like, oh, so we should like create a non-binary prison. And I was like, you missed the point. Like, I was like, you know what? It's like, yeah, like you're just like nodding along and then you go, oh no, you've missed it. And then, yeah, and I was just like so frustrated. I was like, you were nearly there, like you're like starting to like get into the analysis of like how gender and transness relates to prisons and the gender binary and how it relates to indigeneity and stuff like that. And then you go, oh, we should probably create a trans prison. Like, that sounds really stupid and I can't believe you said that. And it's just like, and then lots of people were like, yeah, that's a great idea. And I'm like, what they're going to do is they're going to make it a private prison, and then companies going to like profit off it, and then they're probably going to be on the Pride Parade the next year, be like, oh yeah, we have a non-binary prison, you know, isn't this great? And it just annoyed me so much. But yeah, like basically just like the violence of like the intersection of gender and colonialism is basically just inscribed in the prison, and it's so awful. I don't know where I was going with that, but that story really annoyed me, so I thought I'd give it a bit of yeah. Oh, Hadil.
Yeah, on the topic of like pinkwashing, can you hear me, by the way? Yeah, okay. On the topic of like pinkwashing and queer immigrants, some countries in Europe as well as the US, they only accept they have programs that only accept queer refugees when they don't accept other ones, and like the intention behind this is basically to pose themselves as being the safe haven for refugees, unlike their original countries. But also like part of this process is that these people have to I think it was a bunch of Syrian refugees, queer Syrian refugees, who were trying to go to the US through this program, and they basically rejected their application because they weren't convinced that they were queer. So it's basically also about how do you quote unquote perform queerness to be able to prove that you are queer. Like obviously that's very much going to be quoted as like white and in specific ways. So yeah, so thinking about like the relation between like imperialism and like migration and queerness is very interesting also in terms of like refugees.
Yeah, definitely, completely. And what was I going to say? And also, I sometimes find this really, all this discourse really strange, because people will be like, oh, I don't know, isn't like some people only seem to like extend their solidarity on the basis of perceived queerness, and it ends up being racist all the time. But I'm just like, does it really matter if this person, like, if they're like in some like awful situation, it doesn't matter where they're queer. Like obviously, like it's nice to show solidarity on like basis of on certain characteristics, but it doesn't really matter if someone is being like brutalized and subject to violence, whether they're straight or queer. Like I don't care. Like you should just extend thing to all of them. It's so bad. And yeah, no, but yeah, Hideo, you put it really perfectly there. Josephina. Sorry.
I was Kimmy laughing because Kimmy and I had this discussion. It was triggered by a TikTok, which basically spoke about like how Black and Indigenous people of color often have been like left out of like, or have not been accepted as like being queer or being like non-binary, because like the way that we have understood like non-binariness is shaped by like white people who have been outwardly and like open in being non-binary. And also like we obviously know that in Black and Indigenous like POC communities or like families, it's more difficult to come out because of just the way that like queerness is so like colonial, but also with just like how in being non-binary we have to perform being non-binary, but the performance is basically performing whiteness. So there was a comment that said like literally it's always white, colorful mullet / soft mullet, frog obsessions, commie, cringy artist with a fur obsession, and the cottage core addiction. Ultimately, it's a bit of a fun and joke. Like me too, I love a cottage core, but like to be accepted as being like non-binary, like you have to perform it. And also in being non-binary, like non-binary is such a huge umbrella. It doesn't mean that you're agender. Like you can be a non-binary woman, especially not the frog, you can be non-binary without like saying like you're just going to relinquish like all like I guess performances of gender, because ultimately gender is performance. And like a lot of Black women have a strained relationship with being non-binary because they know that they will always be perceived as a Black woman, which is why a lot of non-binary Black people like who like will say that they are non-binary Black women, and that seems contradictory for you to say that you're still a woman, but they know that like their womanness or womanhood is something that they'll never be able to like release because they will always be perceived as being a Black woman. Therefore they say that they are non-binary Black women, and I completely understand and also like relate to that. But it's just like we as Black and Indigenous people of color, like if we're saying like, okay, we don't want to perform womanness, we don't want to perform manness, we don't want to perform anymore, we just want to be, we want to be whatever we want to be, but then we have to perform whiteness in order to be understood or accepted as being non-binary, then the performance is just getting a bit too complicated. Like I would like to stop being Beyonce, like that's not really what I came here for. So I feel like non-binariness also is just like a very difficult and like convoluted umbrella that is difficult, especially for Black and Indigenous people of color to navigate. That TikTok comment summed it up real good there.
Yeah, definitely. I think, is it Nas next? And I don't know if Hidil next did that. I don't know if that's an old hand though, but Nas first. Okay, I think it's just Nas.
Is Hidil speaking?
No.
Okay, cool. Yeah, no, I'm just going to touch on what Josephina just said. And I guess we touched on it during Decolonizing Queerness yesterday, which if you missed, I'm really sad for you, because it was beautiful. But yeah, no, like just the idea of like having to perform like non-binariness, and like it being like performing to the white gaze, both in terms of white queers and the white gaze as in white people watching. But it's the idea of like of coming out as well, and like having to come out rather than just exist as queer, because you have to validate yourself to the white gaze, and just going back to the question of like if prisons are more than just their physical spaces, how must abolitionist organizing / imagining extend past the prison? I guess just like the idea of like, not the idea, but the feeling of being forced to constantly like out yourself to people rather than let people in, is in like a very metaphorical, abstract way, like a form of incarceration, because you're doing something like against your will, but because that you're being forced to, essentially you don't have much agency in it. I don't know if that made sense, but yeah.
Yeah, and just following on from what Naz and Josephina said, like it's just so tiring, just performing and then also being perceived, because like not only do you have to perform to like your own community or like your own family, and like who subscribe to binaries or take binaries as something more serious than you do, but then it's also you have to perform to whiteness in order to be validated as non-binary, or queer. So like again, it's just tiring, because then like at the most you just want to exist. Like I just want to exist without people perceiving me. And either way, like whatever, it's just sad, because like I feel like whatever environment I'll be in, obviously apart from like these spaces, like I'll just always be perceived, or I always feel like I have to perform or play up to stuff or like standards that I've internalized that I have to play up to, in order to just please other people, or in order to like get people to believe my own identity. Yeah,
I completely agree. And I think on that, like in my heart of hearts, I just know that there's no he and there's no she. So why must I be he or she? Like it's not adding up. Do you get? And I think like a lot being perceived from that. No, yeah, and I think with like being perceived and not only being perceived, but also having to perform, and whiteness still being like the gaze, the whiteness is still the judge of that. And for like blackness, it's like, why in the world that we, Afrofuturism and everything, but in the world that we imagine, white people, they don't exist.
You can't say that.
No, but I just feel like the gaze and all of that is just a bit too much. Whiteness, capital W, so it just doesn't exist. So yeah, I just feel like the constant like desire or the constant need to perform and being judged, and if that performance is good enough, if it's not good enough, like who are you? Just like, girl, shut up, Okay, yeah, if anyone else wants to add, next slide. Oh. Okay, more questions to think about. How is gender heteronormativity and the gender binary imposed through prisons? And what is the relationship between reform and abolition? And we will speak about the second question more tomorrow. So if you feel like we haven't unpacked this enough, then be sure to come tomorrow. I'll start. I think a major part is the kind of like all women's prisons and all men prisons. I don't know, because it's that's a major part, and I think from that it means that women who aren't in like heterosexual relationships can, I think intrinsically prisons, because of how like separated they are and because of how they present it to be, I don't even think it's progressive in the way that they like separate. I think it's, again, like the nature of prisons is a way to control and is a way to control and ensure that communities are separated from each other and that communities can't discuss with each other, in terms of like organizing as well, because separation means that there's limited means of communication, as we've already unpacked, in terms of like bail, in terms of the cost of like sending letters and maintaining contact with like the outside world or like the rest of society. So I think that's one way, but I do think there are many more ways if anyone else wants to talk. So
I think as well, like even like the work, like in America they have like those like prison work programs. I don't know why I'm looking at you. Those like prison work programs where like obviously like prisoners work and they get paid pennies, but like the type of work that they give to the men prisons is like very different to the type of work that they give to the women's prisons, and like the gender division of like labor, I think that's the term, etc. And then also like with like this first bit of writing, whatever, like elsewhere in the reading it talks about this experience of this this trans woman who entered into the prison system, and she was stripped, like the process of being stripped, the process of being given underwear that didn't suit her, like all that kind of like intense level of like perception and visibility and speculation over her, and then being assigned specific like roles, duties, or like expected to fill certain or play a certain part in like the whole prison pantomime kind of thing, and how like gender, like heteronormativity is like violently and like so vulnerably like reinforced through that as well. So yeah.
And I think with that, another way is like the lack of provision. So say, for example, like sanitary towels and how they're not provided in like male prisons. And it reinforces, like it's queerphobia, like it reinforces these ideas that of like belonging and displacement that not only are intrinsic to like prisons in like the building sense, but also in like I don't want to say metaphorical because it's not a metaphor, but in like the wider context of prisons. So say like colonialism, and just like social organization. And then I also wanted to say, even though there are kind of like male prisons and female prisons, and like a lot of like neoliberal feminist organizations are like, let's get trans women in women's prisons, like yes, girl boss, all of that stuff. And in reality, it completely glosses over and doesn't address the violence of prisons. And I think this is why this event is so important, because we know that with gendering and with all things intrinsic to gender, that there is carcerality like intrinsically linked with that. So because as a result of that, abolition is necessary, and abolition is also intrinsic to the conversation. It's not something that occurs afterwards, or it's not something that occurs separately. They need to occur together in order to like holistically and properly attack it at its core. Okay, next slide.
This is just on to like general discussion. I don't think we have very much time left, but we can see how much we can fit in the last 8 minutes, / we can maybe go over, I don't know. So I would read them out, but there are so many, so I think I might just get everyone to read them. And if anyone has any thoughts, put your hand up, or put something in the chat. I don't know if anyone has anything to say.
I've said this too many times, like at every single event, but there's this page on Instagram or like an organization called Healing Justice. And I feel like it's like in these types of community care that is more informal, where violence against queer and trans people is actually addressed, and like I guess like we can actually have the space to or like I don't know, we have like the space to kind of heal and talk about violence without having to entrust carceral systems or police and prisons. So I can link the page. Sorry, there's a fly going around, that's scary.
Yeah, if you could link that, that would be really great. And I think maybe when we send out like the thing at the end of the day with, or like, I think we're sending out some sort of reading list, we could also send some other things then. That might be a good idea.
Or if you just put Healing Justice London on Instagram with LDN, you'll find it.
Cool, thank you. I'm trying to think.
In regards to this, what approaches should be used to address violence against queer and trans people without police, prisons, and carceral solutions more generally? I think the answer that we're all thinking is like radical love, you know, radical love in community with each other. And I'm sorry, but if you missed the All About Love Radical Reading Club, you missed out, because I think in that reading club, it was so like, it was contextualized how important and how necessary love is to the future and like to liberation. It's not, I mean, it's nice being in community. It's nice, you know, like people, like it's nice, but I do think radical love and just like caring for each other in a loving way and wanting the best for people fueled out of love is so important, and that can really inform how we go about abolition, because we know that we don't want people to be punished. Like, we want people to exist as they want to exist, and with no just with no constraints or no restrictions. And I think that is like fundamentally it. And anything that stems from love, anything that stems from radical love will ensure that, and anything that doesn't stem from radical love may not ensure that. So yeah, I think love.
Yeah, and like that reminded me of, I don't know, I can't remember what was I saying. Yeah, on the subject of like community care and love and stuff like that, like what I find interesting is that like this tangentially leads on to what you're saying. It doesn't sound like it does at the start, but I think at the start of the book, it gives a quote of Sylvia Rivera, who was a trans activist living in New York. I think she died in 2002. I'm not sure. But anyway, and basically, like, I thought it's just kind of interesting how, like, in kind of mainstream LGBT discourse, like, she gets like heralded as like as the kind of brilliant activist she was. She was pretty amazing. But then they don't like translate it into any political action, and they don't, if you actually go and like read stuff like her speeches or like any interviews with her, she's literally always been like a police and prison abolitionist. And like it's interesting how like the community in New York, or the gay community in New York, were actually quite like exclusionary of her, and like because she was a sex worker and because she was anti-prison and anti-police. So obviously, like, it's really good that we have like actually caring communities, not communities which are built on exclusion and respectability politics, because the other like queer people in the community at that time, they looked down on her because they were like, oh, she's a sex worker, and you know, she's got in trouble with the police, so I don't know where I was going with this, but basically it's kind of frustrating how like a lot of like queer movements, queer activists like talk about these like these kind of iconic activists, but then don't actually engage with their radical politics, which has been there from the start. Yeah, and also it's really funny. There's I can actually send this later, but there's like an interview. I read this book, which is like it's basically a compilation of like interviews about the street transvestite action revolutionaries, which were like a kind of mutual aid group in the 70s in New York. And it's really funny. There's like a interview with her and a policeman, and it's literally like they don't even put the policeman's name, they just call him Pig, and that is like what he's called throughout the whole interview. It's just like, Pig says this, Sylvia Rivera says that, and it's actually was so funny, and she's actually hilarious. but like basically like when I read that book I was like I just like didn't really realize, because it's not emphasized often, like how like central abolition was to her politics, and I think that's really important to remember when we go through queer history. I don't know where I was going with that, but there you go.
Yeah. Okay, I'll in regards to the first question, why do we need queer and trans perspectives on abolition? I think it goes deeper than that. I think it's not only like queer and trans perspectives, but it's the centering of queer and trans experiences. That the way I see like abolition is like here, and it's like a hole. It's like a hole, and we need to continue like going deeper and deeper into the hole. With that imagery, I don't know, deeper and deeper into the hole, and that's only possible if the most marginalized people in society are centered, so that we can actually like work outwards. Do people see the imagery in and then out? Yeah, it's there.
I get it.
Oh wait, no, go.
No, I was just gonna add on, and like yeah, this idea of like perspectives, when like we do have intersecting identities, like we're not just like queer or trans and like not other things as well, like it's just important in abolition, because again we're trying to abolish categories and binaries here, so the importance of stuff intersecting is something that is crucial in our approaches to abolition and decoloniality.
Nice.
Yeah, I was just going to go on to the third question, which is how have mainstream LGBTQ plus rights organisations been complicit in the prison industrial complex? And again, we did speak about this at Decolonising Queerness yesterday. Again, very sorry for you if you weren't there. It was actually like, is there a recording? Okay, ask for the recording, because you really and truly missed out if you weren't there. But anyway, I forgot what I was saying. Oh yeah, like pride and working with the Home Office, like what is that? Like when the Home Office is in charge of like Yardwood and stuff like that, and like it's deporting queer asylum seekers or queer immigrants who, yeah, they're not safe here because of state violence, etc., 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 but you're putting them in more harm's way if you're deporting them, often to places where they haven't been in years and decades, where they don't have support systems, etc., etc. But then you've got the Home Office sponsoring London Pride or like even Black Pride. What is that about? Come on. Like who's Priti Patel protecting? Like what's going on? But also like in terms of just how like LGBTQ plus organisations are just like, again, hella white in the UK, and just like the main thing that comes to mind is like what's that, the group LGBT plus Labour. It's just full of white centrists, and they're all Islamophobic and like contribute to like the surveillance state of Muslims, supposedly not realizing that Muslims can in fact be queer. And yeah, just like yeah, basically white queers are scary. Yeah.
Is there a next slide that we can go to?
Oh yeah, I just put like a few links to a few things that are like related to I don't even know what I put. I can't even read. 1 second. Oh yeah, I put a few lists. Sorry. Oh, I just realised my camera's on. Shit. Sorry for swearing. Oh yeah, I've put a few links for a few things. Sorry, I'm such a mess. For things that you can like look up, but also there's a few like organisations, like there's like a campaign against prison expansion in the UK, and they're a really, really good organisation. They also have some really good events on abolition, which I would recommend. They have like an Abolition 101 event, which I thought was really good. And also there are these two projects. One is I'm sorry, I've got to bring it up to my face again. One is the Bent Bars project. And basically they do stuff like it's like writing to like queer prisoners in the UK, and you can like, they will like help you get in contact with people. And I haven't done it yet, but I'm planning on doing it because I think it's something that I have time to do and I should do. And then there's also Books Beyond Bars, and basically they help get books, just like any sort of books, to prisoners. Oh my god, I do actually. Oh my god, I do. I actually am like a granddad. That actually basically just me. But anyway, but yeah, Books Beyond Bars, they like help send out books for free to prisoners in the UK, especially like queer fiction to LGBT prisoners who like don't get any of that content in prisons. Sometimes they like I just follow their account, and I'm going on a bit of a ramble here, but sometimes on their Twitter they show like the things that they're not allowed to send. Like sometimes they get stuff sent back by the prisons because the prisons are like, oh no, that's too radical, or that's like too, I don't know what the criteria is, but it's really awful. Kind of something Faye was saying earlier, but anyway. But yeah, you can follow those links, you can take a picture of those things, and we will send out links later on different things about prison abolition and queer stuff. Like I have a big long reading list that I can send. Next slide. I think that's it. I can't remember. We'll see.
Yeah, I think.
Yeah, that's it.
Thank you everyone for coming. Does anyone have anything that they want to say as well? Like, yeah, feel free to either put it in the chat, put your hand up. But we are going to. Oh yeah. So we're gonna have a 10 minutes? 6 minutes? Oh, I don't know, 6 or 10.
I don't have the number 6.
Okay, we're gonna have a 10-minute break. So we'll be back at 5:44, and that's for the closing remarks, and also we're a colonial present, and we do have amazing people speaking there. So I hope everyone enjoyed, learned something. I hope everyone, even if you haven't been able to access the book, there is a link in the Eventbrite, like to the PDF, and once Liberation Conference is over, a big reading list should be going out very soon, so keep your eyes peeled for that. And I think that's everything. So
yeah, thank you everyone for coming. I hope you thought it was okay.
Yeah, I hope you enjoyed. We want more radicals reading clubs, because I just love radicals. I feel like it's because I speak so much anyway. And I'll see you guys in 10 minutes.